Our story today was about the Lord calling some of his first disciples. And the disciples were fishermen before they were disciples. One of the things I love about that story is that later the disciples, while they're disciples, go fishing again, and the Lord gives them instruction because they had fished all night and failed to catch anything. So they cast their net on the other side, and when they haul in the fish, they've caught so many that their net begins to break. And they're astonished that the Lord knew what was going to happen and could guide them this way. Another story about sort of the disciples is after the Lord had been crucified and he had sent them out to baptize all nations. The disciples decided to go fishing again, and they tried to go fishing all night, and the Lord again told them to try a different way, and they caught so many fish it was almost breaking their net. And they hauled it in, and then he kind of admonishes them. And he basically says, "Why aren't you tending the flocks and feeding my sheep?" And all of his analogies are about being a shepherd, as if they had to stop being fishermen and start being shepherds. Now, what's lovely about that story is in history we know that the disciples, after that moment, did not become shepherds. They didn't actually literally go do sheep work. They became apostles. Because the Lord was trying to expand their mind, to remind them that when he called them as fishermen, and when he taught them about how to be fishermen, and when he said that they would become fishers of men, he was speaking allegorically, that there was another meaning to his words. And so when he told them to go be shepherds, they knew right away what the Lord meant. Each of these kinds of jobs gives us an allegory, a way of thinking about how the Lord prepares and calls and sends people. Now, if you think about heaven for a moment, heaven is made up of an innumerable variety. There's so many different kinds of people that go to heaven. And they all have different jobs, both in heaven, but also different experiences on earth. Some people were doctors on earth, some people plumbers, some people teachers, some people financing, whatever. Everyone had a different experience. Some people died as children. Other people grew to old age. Some people were mentally disabled their whole life. Other people had health that was fine. Maybe they were an Olympic athlete. Different experiences in their past. And those experiences create different foundations for different uses in heaven. Everything that you experience on earth is foundational for life in heaven. Think about this, perhaps in a way that's easy to understand. We know, just from science, that babies who are cuddled and hugged and held and sung to do better in life than children and infants who are not. That it's not enough to get food and shelter and warmth and changing, but that the affection that people give babies literally helps them throughout the rest of their life. Yet who here remembers being a baby? Not me. You don't remember it. But did it form you? Absolutely. So think about somebody perhaps who has Alzheimer's, who does not remember what happened yesterday. Holding their hand or saying something loving to them forms them. Those experiences continue to be foundational for what happens later in their spiritual life, even in heaven. Which means even for people who, from the outside perspective, aren't growing, are still being prepared by the Lord. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's true in all aspects of our lives. In every aspect of your life, the Lord is preparing you. Preparing you to become a disciple, but like the disciples, the 12, preparing you to become an apostle. An apostle means someone who was sent out. That's what that word means. Sent out. In this case, by Jesus. And they were sent to do a specific thing. To gather people back to the Lord. An angel is a messenger. In our case, a messenger from the Lord, bringing a message of the Lord's love and truth. So apostles are just earthly angels. That's all they really are. So that's what we can aspire to be. Yes, we can aspire to be angels, but realistically, we're not always angelic. But we can aspire to be apostles, in that we can bring people to the Lord through our actions. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's talk about the spiritual divine allegory of fishermen. We talked before with the children how these fishermen were not spear fishermen or casting fishermen, rod fishermen. They were net fishermen. And that when the Lord told them to fish, he would say things like, cast your net. So they're doing huge amounts of stuff. Now, they're not being indiscriminate. They're not just throwing their nets willy-nilly. They're fishermen. They know some of the better places or the worst places in the Sea of Galilee on where to fish. They probably have their spots. And they can probably see birds and other signs of where fish might be. They think critically about where to cast their nets. But once they get there, they're throwing nets. And how long might they fish? We have examples in the Word. All night. So it's not like they cast their net once, not catch anything, and say, well, never mind, guess there's no fish in the sea. Time to give up. No one's ever going to come. They cast, and they cast, and they cast again. And sometimes the Lord tells them to try a different way, and when it works, often their nets break. When their nets break, they don't think, oh, never mind, I guess that net's no good. They think, well, that net worked. Let's fix it up, make it strong again, and go out again the next night. It's a constant endeavor. Even any of you who have done rod fishing know that fishing it's sort of like a sport, but it's really a mental sport. It's about being patient and making improvements on the margin. If you've ever talked to a fly fisherman, and if you're willing to be patient and ask them leading questions, they can regale you with details of very particular flies. Why this one, I tied it like this, and I made it this way. You can't buy your own because then you can't adjust it this way, and they're making marginal improvements. And it seems crazy from our perspective why they would put so much effort into marginal improvements. But if they're sitting there for a week on a river, fly fishing, marginal improvements can be the difference between catching one fish in a week or 20, just by making little marginal improvements. The same is true when rod fishing or when casting nets. All those little marginal improvements make a big difference. The same is true with our spiritual lives. Our spiritual lives are not about miraculous revelations, although those exist. It's about marginal improvement. We're using fishing as our analogy for now, partly because it's from the Word, but also because it's from the Word, we can know more about the details of what it means. But I invite you on your own to think about the things you're an expert in. Maybe the law, or computer programming, or childcare. I don't know, you do. I promise you, there are things that you have expertise in that you can use to understand how the Lord is teaching you and guiding you and helping you make marginal improvements. But back to fishing for just a moment. The net represents the understanding of an individual. The mending of the nets can represent the reformation of a church, or, because a church can be a person, the reformation of a person. You see, the Lord puts each of us through two processes, reformation and regeneration. Reformation is the reformatting, and yes, you computer people can think about that, the reformatting of the way we think, rearranging one thing on top of another, moving things around so they work more in an organized, logical way, in a stronger network, taking some false ideas and moving them aside. And we're taught in the heavenly doctrine that reformation is the first stage. In other words, the way the Lord's going to marginally improve you is how you think and speak. And later, how you do and who you love. But first, it's just the way you think and speak. And so for today, don't worry about who you love. Well, that's very, very important. Just how you think and how you speak. An example I like to use is spelling. When I was a little kid, around 4th grade, I took a big spelling test. And in that spelling test were like 200 words. And they were supposed to be all the words that a good 4th grader should be able to spell. And I tanked this test. I did terribly on it. There are many theories as to why I did badly on this test. One theory, my theory at the time when I was 9 or 10, was I am a bad speller. That was my theory. I am a bad speller. I'll give you a clue. I was wrong. Not necessarily wrong about my current state of affair, but I was wrong to have said it that way. So then I spent the next 3 years in remedial spelling. When I got to 7th grade, my 7th grade teacher, Mr. Irwin, looked at me and said, "Pierce, you can spell." I said, "Oh." From then on, I turned into a good speller. It was like magic. No idea what happened there. Now, part of what happened is that I went through work and I learned how to be a better speller. Another part was that a teacher told me that I could identify myself differently. What would have been more accurate, more truthful, and more honest as a 10-year-old, if I had known to say this, would be, in the past, I have been a bad speller. Let's try that with math. You know, some people who just say, "Oh, I'm no good at math." Well, maybe. How about a more honest statement would be, in the past, I have struggled with math. Do you see how discretely different those things are? They sound the same, yet they're marginally different, aren't they? One of them describes reality. The other one appropriates the past onto yourself and therefore determines your future. Now, spelling and math, no offense to all the wonderful teachers out there, not super important directly for your spiritual life. They're useful, granted. In the past, I have lost my temper. In the past, I have told lies. In the past, I have hurt people's feelings on purpose. Different than, I am a liar. I am a cruel person. Do you see the difference? They're discretely different. They're marginally different. But they're importantly different. One of them describes the past. Very useful. If we have done something wrong, we should describe it, label it, and stop doing it. The other one appropriates that evil to our heart and determines our future. And this is one of the main ways hell gets us. They try to have us look at our faults, which we should do, examine them critically, which we should do, feel guilty about them, which we kind of should do, and then they twist it and say, and therefore you are that evil. And that's victory for them. Because then you give up. If you are evil, and there's nothing to do about it, if you are a hopeless sinner, well, then you're going to hell. Give up. But if you are a person who has sinned, a sinner who is hopeless without the Lord, but you have the Lord, then that can be the past. And how we speak and think about these things is important. This is an example of reformation. Being able to think slowly and critically about sin and guilt and self-improvement, being able to use more accurate language, ends up letting us treat ourselves more kindly. And it lets us open the door for the Lord to change our hearts. It's worth practicing. Slow down your thinking. Think critically about whether or not you're saying something condemning about yourself or just accurate that you can fix. Ride easy. There are innumerable examples that I'm sure that you can find in your own life. Perhaps something you've even said about yourself and your spiritual life that maybe wasn't totally accurate, maybe was too self-condemnatory. Slow down your thinking. There are many useful ways that you can do this. Going to church is a really powerful way. Hearing people preach to you, listening to teachers, reading books, reading the Word, conversation. These are the examples from True Christian Religion that we read today. It's one of the reasons why you can actually be an apostle. Just with your friends, your loved ones. You can just talk to them, listen. Most of the time, you're not going to need to correct. But sometimes, if you hear your friend say something like, "Oh, I can't believe that other person. I'm just so angry at them, I'm never going to be able to forgive them." Or, "Oh, it's always so," and I don't know what it's going to be, but always is almost always a red flag. Or, never's another red flag. Watch out for those words. Those are sneaky words. And if you've got a friend who uses one of those, and you've listened and you've been given time and space, maybe say, maybe it's not always. But use your judgment. Use your discernment. Use the wisdom that you have. The Lord has actually already prepared you, just as He has prepared everyone. And He's constantly preparing you to be a better disciple, but yes, also to be an apostle, to go out in all the ways that you live and be that force for good. And yes, we can think about how to love people by giving them hugs and doing service and all these other wonderful things, but you can also be a servant to others by helping them just think a little clearer, maybe a little slower, about what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. And in that way, you can be an apostle. And yes, even an angel. Amen. Please bow your heads. Oh, no. I got to see, that's why I asked for forgiveness. Yes, if you will kneel for a brief prayer or bow your heads.